All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be dialing in. And hello to those who might be watching us on replay. Thank you for being here. Thank you for dialing in. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your time and energy with us here. As you can see, and welcome to the month of February. I haven't done any lives in February, so welcome to that. I have, as you've noticed, put out quite a bold and loaded question for our conversation today. What makes a DEI expert? And that is our first topic in the February series of Unpacking DEI. And so the motivation for that has been probably about threefold. But one of those things is that there have been, several questions that I have been asking myself around this. What is the acumen DEI professionals must have to carry this expert badge? With DEI being such a broad topic, can anyone call themselves a DEI expert? And who has the power and the authority to assess, approve, or deny one's expertise level in this space? So these are just some of the questions that in one shape or form or another have been on my mind and what I've been asking myself as more and more people enter this DEI space and sort of self-proclaim themselves quote unquote experts. While I've also noticed a trend where a lot of people with actually degrees in this space and potentially decades of experience in this field often shy away from labeling themselves as something DEI specific. And this is also happening while Cornell and similar institutions are getting rich from producing DEI accreditations. So there is quite a bit to unpack in this topic, and there are so many, doors that we can open. So we'll see where the conversation goes today. But before that, and before we start unpacking it, I would love to welcome both of my guests, Anastasia and Melanie, to the stage. And I would love for both the ladies to introduce themselves, just so you all know the caliber of guests I have today. So I'm super excited to have a conversation with both of you. Melanie, would you like to go first?
Why not? Thank you, Baiba, for that lovely introduction. So my name is Melanie Jacob, and I am a diversity and inclusion consultant. I like to call myself a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging consultant, but, to make it shorter, I'm originally from the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, and I've lived in Martinique, Barbados, Lyon, and now in Paris. And it's thanks to these different experiences that I was able to see the world for what it truly is and realize equity doesn't actually exist. And I wanted to play a role in that, especially with a background in languages as well as a master's in communications, media, and PR. It really made me realize that there's not a lot of representation, positive representation of Black and brown people and people of color. So this is what pushed me to start my own consultancy in France. And I'm really looking forward to playing a bigger role in the changes that I'd like to see across Europe.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And you have already been a huge advocate for this work in Europe. I have attended several of your talks where you're unpacking how certain things show up and do not show up in our everyday lives in Europe. So thank you for having that conversation, because I think a lot of the DEI conversations often centered around the US and the UK, but there's a much wider conversation that we can have here. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here. Anastasia.
Thanks, Baiba, and pleasure to meet you, Melanie. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very delighted to be in conversation with you precisely for the reason that you mentioned, Baiba. I am based here in the United States, so I find that a lot of times, as you mentioned, these conversations are kind of limited to the UK and the US context. I'm really excited about the kind of transnational perspective here. So my name is Dr. Anastasia Kārkliņa Gabriel. I am a cultural strategist, a brand consultant, and a formally trained cultural theorist. I have an academic background, having spent nearly 10 years in the academy pursuing my doctorate in American cultural studies, but more specifically in critical race, gender, and sexuality studies. And since then, I've transitioned to working in advertising, and specifically in brand research and strategy. And although I participate in various D&I initiatives, I do not necessarily see myself as a DI consultant, but do see DI thinking as core to my work as that with which I approach whatever I do, whether it is in research or strategy or any other space. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And you also have had some really interesting conversations that you have been pulled into, and I also know that you have sort of earlier in your career, you also have spent some time out in Asia, out in Africa, immersing yourself in the culture, and I'm sure that has also informed some of the work that you're doing. So I'm very excited to have both of you here with such broad experience, but also quite niche knowledges. So thank you both for being here. And I just want to also say to everyone and anyone who is joining us today that the chat is open, chat is live. So please feel free to share in your thoughts on any of the questions, any of the things that we are discussing here today. Feel free to ask in questions. As you can see, we've got amazing experts here on the stage who I'm sure will be happy to unpack any of those for you as well. So I'm excited, obviously, but we've got just under an hour together to jump right in it. And where I would love to start is with this loaded big question of what makes a DEI expert. And just to check in with both of you, when you hear this notion of a DEI expert, what are the things that you're thinking or feeling when you see anyone labeling themselves as a DEI expert? Would love to just sort of start that. Anastasia, would you love to take this first?
Oh, sure. Let me pull up my chair and get started, because it is such a loaded term. And I think it brings up a lot of thoughts for me, and mostly not in relation to other people who may identify themselves as DEI experts, but mostly as an exercise in introspection related to my own positionality and my own work. And so on one hand, I do not identify, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, a lot of people do not identify or are hesitant to identify with this label. On the other hand, I do believe that my training falls into the purview of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so a lot of that hesitation, I think, for me, comes from thinking about the DEI expert as a kind of professional figure, and contextualizing that DEI expert in the history of movement work. For context, I have been part of a lot of grassroots organizing work, a lot of anti-racist, anti-fascist, labor justice movements here in the United States. And so when I hear the word DEI expert, there is a kind of suspicion and uneasiness that I have, that I think we should all have in terms of critically engaging with the space and what it means. Insofar as I feel like the DEI expert is a kind of professionalized figure that in a lot of spaces now is juxtaposed against the activist figure, right? And so in some ways there is access to power, and there is access to authority given by that expertise, to be in the rooms with people that hold power, to be able to raise questions that are important, that are crucial, that should be discussed and should be advocated upon. But at the same time, there is a kind of process of professionalization that I think raises a lot of interesting questions about what it means to be an expert in the space, so to say, and to do what I would call liberation work within the context of the institution. I think, what comes to mind is a kind of words professionalization, power, but also policing of radical thinking for me. And that's where the tension of that term lies precisely in this dilemma of what it means to be able to have access to rooms as an expert, this panel, to be able to bring forward certain perspectives, while also knowing that there are limits to your expression. And for example, as a DEI expert, you might not be able to show up to a boardroom of CEO and talk about being a prison or police abolitionist, within the context of the United States, or being a Marxist, or being in a kind of political alignment with grassroots people-led movement. So there is this tension and all of the contingencies of what it means to be an expert within the institution that is not interested in radical thought per se, but how do you subversively use that expertise in order to push those perspective forward? So that's kind of what comes up for me in a lot of complicated ways.
Wow. And thank you so much for, introducing and walking us into this conversation with such introduction. And I loved how you unpacked it and sort of showed us how many different ways we can go with that, and actually how this how expert has potentially evolved from what we usually would have called, an advocate or or an ambassador or anything like that. And actually, it also is about what does expert as such, the word as such means and what it means in this context. So thank you so much for bringing that first and foremost. Melanie, would love to hear your reflections.
Well, I'm thinking more about expert in terms of you having substantial knowledge in an area of expertise. And when it comes to DEI, especially in Europe, because I'm going to talk about the European context a lot, it seems that there are a lot of people who have been doing this work for a long time, but they were not really focusing on DEI apart from just people with disabilities or members of the LGBTQ plus community, and sometimes even when it comes to gender parity. And I feel like a lot of people consider themselves an expert, but then they don't even think about other groups of people who have been marginalized. They haven't done much research when it comes to other groups, because I'm not saying that you have to be an expert in every single person who comes from a marginalized community, but you have to be an ally for these people, for these groups of people. And now what we're trying to do more and more in Europe is to get people to talk about other forms of diversity. And for that reason, I don't really consider an expert in the field, like somebody would have a broad knowledge of all of these different communities, because even I wouldn't consider myself an expert. But again, some people might say it's due to my imposter syndrome, being a Black woman in a space that's usually taken up by white people. And even that's another aspect of diversity that we have to think about in Europe. A lot of people who are considered professionals, specialists, experts, they have similar backgrounds and they don't have marginalized backgrounds, like a background like my own, being a foreigner, being somebody who is not a native speaker of the language widely being spoken in the country that they live in. So I just think that all of these aspects we have to think about when we're talking about an expert. What actually are you specializing in? What are you an expert in? What experiences are you bringing to the forefront? And just, are you open to different types of dialogues with different kinds of people? And yeah, that's what I would have to add to this conversation.
Thank you both. And I think what both of you are alluding to in a way is that none of us is a container with all of the tools, with all the answers, with all the perspectives, with all the lived experiences. And so again, does expert mean, do you have all that? In that case, none of us can ever be an expert. Or is an expert, someone who perhaps represents or talks about a specific topic where they have maybe education, maybe lived experiences, maybe grassroots experience, and so on. So thank you for initiating a conversation there. I would love to dig a little bit deeper, as Melanie, you've alluded around this sort of specific skills and experiences. And I know you also posted an interesting post a couple of weeks ago around unpacking a job description of a DEI manager, I think it was, that you found on LinkedIn, and you highlighted several things and said, that the more DEI roles you see advertised on LinkedIn, the more you are reminded you're not qualified, quote unquote, for these roles. So I would love to talk a little bit about sort of the entry requirements, I guess, in this space, and what would be sort of what would we be expecting from a DEI specialist, professional, expert, however the person decides to label themselves as they walk into this space. Because again, going to the job descriptions, I'm currently doing a DEI job description and advert audit to see how actually organizations are talking about these roles. And most are expecting a degree in DEI, HR, or psychology, expecting a number of years of experience, expecting to be a coach and coach leadership teams. So there's a real broad and specific things that organizations are looking for. And I think that where the gap lays a little bit, at least, for someone, and I'm sure, you'll be able to echo this as professionals in this space, is that there is this expectation from DEI professionals, but it not necessarily matches the commitment that organizations have for this work. And so I would love to dig a little bit deeper. And one more thing that I want to also mention about the job descriptions, also just reflecting, is that organizations often put these expectations on job descriptions, on adverts, but just the amount of times I have had, recruiters or hiring managers wanting to pick my brain about what are some of the questions I should ask in a DEI interview. And then the question is, I can give you a whole question bank, but what difference is it going to make if you don't know what a good answer looks like or what good actually looks like? So then again, it just alludes to the sense of how performative the activity of hiring someone, quote unquote, expert to come into the space. And so I would love to sort of go into, what are the basic expectations, the entry requirements for someone calling themselves a DEI specialist or someone labeling themselves as one. What would be sort of the basic things and the bare minimum they should be bringing to the table? And Melanie, perhaps I'm going to go to you first this time around, following the post that you recently created.
Well, before we even start that conversation, I just want to say how I did do that post, yes. And I actually sent it to the HR manager at that company. And I did have a follow-up meeting with them about the post. And apparently they just started working for this company, working for another company that I actually worked with them prior to. So we had a very interesting conversation, and they realized that post was very problematic. And they said that they actually learned a lot and they would like to work with me in the future, especially since they just hired a new diversity and inclusion manager. So I did not want to do that post to just call out a company. That's why I blocked the name as well as certain identifying factors that would make you know like which company I was referring to. But it's just like sometimes you see these things and you're so frustrated because you realize that what I do, it's not to sound narcissistic, but what I do, nobody else does because of my lived experiences, because of my educational background, because of having lived and worked in Europe and in different countries. I know what it feels like to be the only person, not only because of my ethnicity, not because of my first language or because of my culture, but also because of like my social awareness and just like the skills that I've acquired throughout me being a human being. So when I see some of these entry requirements, I don't think you actually need to have a degree for you to be working in diversity and inclusion, because if you come from a background, especially a marginalized background, where you were not even thought, like probably people didn't even think that you would be able to achieve educational success, why should I stop you from working in this post just because like you come from a background that's not usually like working? Because I feel like in DEI you need to have experiences that are not really the typical experience, because this is what makes you go into a company and tell them, if you're actually serious about hiring people who look like me, this is what you need to do. These are the obstacles that I faced when I was in the job market, and this is how I think that you can improve on it. And if you're actually just eliminating people without a degree, especially when you know socially, economically, politically, these people were not able to enter the job market due to a whole plethora of reasons, especially if you're in Europe and we want to talk about colonization and the effects of that. Why are you limiting your job pool, especially in a role that is supposed to be advocating for employees or people from different backgrounds, marginalized backgrounds? So that's one aspect of that. Another aspect is when you have job adverts like this, you're specifically saying you want somebody to play a whole different set of roles. You want somebody to wear a whole different set of hats. One thing that we always advocate for and Bible advocates for, especially in DI, is mental health. And we know that a lot of people doing this work, they suffer from a lot of mental issues, burnout, and you're telling people, like, if you're going to work in this space, you have to be able to do a whole set of things without any support. Because a lot of people that I work with who work in DEI, who are the heads of DEI at their company, they have no support. They're the only ones doing this job. And they are the ones having to go out and hire different people to speak at different events. On top of, sometimes they're actually holding an HR role. And because DEI has become the a la mode thing, they just say, okay, you work in HR, we're going to have you be our DEI manager now, and you have to be in charge of this, that. And then at the end of the day, there's so much pressure and there's a lot of burnout happening at these different companies. And you're wondering, why don't you have a team to support you? Because if you're the principal of a school, you have a vice principal to help you. If you're working as a supervisor, you have an assistant supervisor. If you're a manager, you have an assistant manager. How comes for a DEI post, people think that only one person can be in charge of talking about all these different subjects and themes that encompass diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I think I'll take a break now because I'm getting very passionate about it. And I'll leave the floor to Anastasia.
Before I go to Anastasia, I just want to pick up on some of the things that you just said, and just to echo that, because of course, when we look at an organization, especially if you look at, I don't know, Fortune 500, FTSE 100 organizations with thousands of employees, you have technology department of like 500 people, you have marketing department of 500 people, you've got HR of 500 people, and then you've got a lone DEI person who has been loaded with fixing the whole culture. And then their job descriptions would say, you need to be able to analyze data, you need to be able to put together events, you need to be able to create a whole L&D program, and you need to be sitting on the executive board and coaching leadership. So we are going from what there would be whole teams doing in say, data analysis or insights management, all the way to, coaching, leadership, and those kinds of things. And we are packing all of that in one shopping list under one person. And that's already, speaking of mental well-being, that's already pressure to people in this area who are quote unquote not qualified, but doing this work, thinking, oh, I need to go on this course and I need to now become a coach. And maybe I need to take up on some analytics courses because I don't match any of these the shopping list. Basically, I don't even want to call it a standard, because I think right now we don't even have a standard to what this space should actually look like. So I will just leave it as that. And I just wanted to say there are quite a few comments. Chat is going. It's busy, and people are sharing some of their thoughts, and there's some questions there as well that I'll pick up a little bit later. But people are saying that. Isaac is saying that the entry requirement should be an open mind. Probably that's a good place to start for sure. And Rita is asking, I would love to hear your thoughts about specific qualifications that people would need in this space. But I think we'll be unpacking that as we go. So thank you all for being here, and keep those questions coming. But Anastasia, the floor is yours to reflect on what we've been talking about.
Sure thing. Yeah. I mean, I guess the only thoughts I have are echoing Melanie's contribution, and I'm in full agreement. Despite being an academic, I think academic credentials are overrated in this space, and that is a result of the professionalization of liberation or equity work, whatever you want to call it, that I mentioned in the beginning, right? And so we can think of that knowledge is free. Knowledge is free. Anyone have access to knowledge, right? People have the capacity to educate themselves. And, I have been in the space long enough to know that there are a lot of brilliant organic intellectuals, for example, who are able to articulate very complex thoughts about the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and class, or oppressive systems, without having, a formal graduate degree or a DI degree. And I'm not really sure, when I say that, I'm not really sure what that means. And so I think at the same time, I also I want to kind of challenge the idea, the idea of entry requirements, right? Because I do think that it leads us again into this path of professionalization, right? I want to think about what it means to enter the space with critical consciousness, what it means to enter the space with values and political commitments. to certain vision of social change, right? That what interests me the most. And perhaps that would be, my entry requirements for, my firm if I were to own one. And perhaps organizations and companies are not necessarily interested in that. And I think we should have a conversation. Why not? Right? There is, a very skill-based approach, a very managerial approach to DE&I. But I would say, as a CEO of a company or even as a VP at a company that is hiring, you should be looking, if you want to do this work, right, you should be looking for somebody who is able to enter your organization and speak frankly and honestly about what is happening within your organization, right? Be a mirror for the realities that, your employees are facing, the way that the culture is reinforcing oppressive dynamics, et cetera. And so to me, it's, there is a kind of managerial aspect, and we can get into that in another question or another part of this discussion, that is really moving us away from focusing on values, on political commitments, on what it is that the ultimate vision of D&I is. If I'm a DI professional applying to your organization, what is my ultimate goal? And I think because it's so professionalized and because we are so focused on, these entry requirements, whether you have a formal experience being at a company, whether you have a formal experience, years of experience in HR managing teams, there's a certain cheapening for me of the essence of this work. And so I want to mostly talk about how do we revive that within the space.
Those are some really interesting points, especially around the professionalization, and it also just shows how difficult it is for us to adjust to new roles and new ways of engaging with business and new ways of thinking about leadership in business, because everything so far has been very quantifiable. If you're in sales, this is how many calls you do, this is how many sales, and this is the sales funnel, this is, everything is quantifiable, and you can quantify them at every single stage. Same with, for instance, talent acquisition, how many people you've hired, how much it costs company, how many, external agencies you've used, and so on. Now, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that becomes a little bit more tricky because we are talking about moving people and moving cultures. So how do you quantify that? And of course, there is a lot of McKinsey and all this sort of, big four, reviews and research being done, and that gives specific numbers of how your performance is going to increase and how your engagement is going to increase and those kinds of things. And that's probably a conversation for another day. But then my question is, how do we performance review DEI professionals in a fair manner? And why I ask that question is because we've got this this mindset that everything is quantifiable, and we talk about business case, and often we actually don't define this business case, and then this DEI professional who's come in with skills and best intentions and passion, whatever it might be, becomes the scapegoat for bad practices for the organization, just because they haven't thought about what it actually means and how will they be measuring progress and growth. So I would love to talk a little bit about, how do we assess this work and do that, and maybe we don't have to do performance review for D&I professionals, but how do we at least not make them the scapegoats for the organizational bad practices? Who would love to go first? Because I can pick on any.
I could start if Anastasia doesn't mind.
Sure, of course, go ahead.
Because this is kind of linked to a point that I made earlier. There's actually the fact that, we have DEI professionals, and then we have them entering these companies, and we have all of these entry requirements that are required, obviously needed for them to get this post. But then once they actually get into the job, they realize that there's no support at all from the company. A lot of them are just there as just figures to be like, yes, we have a DEI expert or specialist or manager, leader, whatever you want to call it, but then we're not actually giving them support. There's no budget when it comes to having and putting on events. You just feel like you're there as like a lone wolf. And then when it comes to now giving a performance review for these people, who is actually, if you're a DEI expert and you're the only one in your company or professional specialist, whatever, who is trained enough at that company to give you a performance review? Because you're coming in there as a professional telling them this is what needs to change, this is where we need support, this is what your employees are saying needs to change. But the company has not been doing that for years. And now you're the one coming in there telling them you need to change this. So you get what I mean? Like, how can we assess this person when the company is probably feeling, and I mean, obviously it's going to happen. They're feeling like you're attacking us. And we saw it recently with a huge tech company where the DI person was actually doing what they were supposed to do. And they were like, oh no, we don't like what you're doing. You're doing a little bit too much of what we expected you to do. So it's just making me wonder, how can we actually assess the work that you're doing when we haven't taken the necessary steps to improve on our biases, on our treatment of our employees, and just how we treat people in general at our company.
That's very interesting because, again, going back to those job descriptions where organizations are saying we need someone with 2 or 5 or 10 years of experience, and then the organization itself has 0 years of experience, and yet they are the ones who are assessing my work when I'm coming in as a quote unquote expert or specialist in this space. So that's
without
also
giving you support.
Right. And this is another thing, who is here, is the organization coming to me saying, actually, please come in and help us understand, let's work together, let's partner up in unpacking what's going on with this organization. But actually, there are too far and few organizations who do that. And organizations approach these DEI specialists often with very specific asks. I need a one-off unconscious bias training. I need a one-off anti-racism training. Let's put together a webinar for Black History Month, right? So there isn't necessarily, so this is not I feel the appropriate and effective way of using our time first and foremost. And yet there's still plenty of people who are making a lot of money out of this. And so there's, again, this conflict around how we as experts are often creating harm in this space by doing certain things and not doing certain things and not asking certain questions. Anastasia, please.
Yeah, so this idea of performance review, I guess that makes me think about, the question of what it means to kind of take back power within this, within the space, because I feel like as quote unquote DI professionals, a lot of what I'm seeing is a kind of merging within the institutional model, right? Where, we have these scenarios when where a DI expert professional will undergo performance review. And I think Melanie rightly mentioned, like, what expertise do you have to review me? And I think, it is, that is the kind of, again, I talk about professionalization and the kind of managerial dynamic when it comes to DEI. And also the reason why I'm very excited to see a lot of practitioners in the space create their own consultancies, create their own businesses, because this idea of performance review within an organization creates a dynamic where I can be policed for the kind of input for what I'm able to say, right? And that is one of the reasons why, I'm often contacted by recruiters to join an organization full time, and I resist that because I really value my independence and my, ethical and moral independence as someone who engages with these questions. Because to be completely transparent, there are multiple times when I have been in rooms working with teams and have usually unfortunately it happens so, and we can talk about why, a white woman in a senior leadership position that will begin clashing with, with me or with the work that is happening in the room, right? And obviously, as a white woman in the space, I already can bring certain perspectives that some of my colleagues who are women of color or Black women don't even have the opportunity to, voice in the room and not be able, aggressive, rude, angry, etc. But there is, for me, when I think about this word performance review, do, there's a kind of expectations of professionalism. And I think professionalism is like fundamentally a function of white supremacy, in the way that it disciplines people against speaking truth with power, against expressing themselves, against challenging power. And obviously, most of institutions, unfortunately, in the world that we live in, perhaps want to be a bit more diverse and equitable, but I think we have a long way to go at how willing organizations are to be challenged and to really sit with the discomfort of the kind of oppressive practices, inequitable dynamics that exist in their spaces. So all that is to say that I think I want to take back our power as DI professionals or practitioners, or whatever you want to call it, because it is those organizations that need us. It's those organizations that need the expertise and insight of people's lived experience to learn from, rather than to review, DI professionals and then obviously fire. Let's just be real, fire people who, speak too loudly, who push kind of the boundaries too much. And, when we talk about performance review, I want to talk about the organization. What are you, paying your workers? Okay, you're paying a certain level, of pay to your white collar workers. What about people who are packaging and cleaning, and who are performing manual labor? Are you extending the same equity? What about paternity leave? What is the, sense of psychological safety in your boardrooms and in your meetings room? Let's, essentially, let's turn the lens back on the organizations that need to change, that need to do the work, versus, essentially subjecting, DI practitioners to censure. I think it, in the end, it is a kind of policing of thought, which, as I mentioned before.
Thank you, Anastasia. And you're absolutely right. Again, you're going back to all of these words that we talk about: entry requirements, skills, performance reviews. They are, the product of white supremacy. And we do have to talk about those things. What professional even means, where does that come from? And, we've talked about that in many contexts. What is professional comes out in different contexts. So thank you for that view. And we've got some comments from people in the from LinkedIn. And Jessica, for instance, is contributing to the conversation, saying is that I tend to see the role of a DEI expert as a facilitator in many situations, at least in a consultant role. They are challenging conventions, pointing them to different unconscious biases and helping them to shift their own culture. And this is also a very, very interesting point. And there's probably a whole conversation we can have around this in terms of how much does a consultant shift the culture, and how much does a consultant bring in a package solution. And that's also, how in a professional world we think about a consultant versus a coach, for instance, or a permanent employee. So thank you, Jesse, for that. And Jesse is just following that up with, and of course, bring insight to help find accountability, so that it is not a one-off thing or box ticked. And accountability is also a very, very interesting point. And I think for DEI professionals, there has to be a lot of self-accountability coming into this space.
Can I say something, Fiber? Sorry to cut in.
Yeah, please go on.
No, but I was just, after seeing that comment, I was just thinking about, there are a lot of people who work in DEI of all races who are literally just in it for the money. And I have had the unfortunate experience of working with some of them. Some of them, it's just because they want to have a Black woman working with them so they could show some form of like more, what is the word that I'm looking for? Just to show that they're more like experts in the field, or that they're more open-minded, so they're willing to work with a Black woman. And it can be other Black women doing this. Has happened to me, even when it comes to equity, when it comes to pay, when it comes to just transparency. So it's like, we're talking about working with consultants, working with experts, professionals, whatever label you want to put on it. But there's some people who are literally just in this field so that they can make a profit and they can take advantage of what's going on in the world right now. And I think that's really sad, because these other people, a lot of the times, who do get the major contracts, who do work with the major companies and are recommended and suggested by different people working in the field just because they have connections. And as you know, like I started working in DEI with absolutely no network. I knew nobody. I moved to France a few years ago and I was going through the job market, and it was just by chance in October 2019 that I came across a Forbes article talking about DEI, and I had no idea that was a job. And when I saw it, I was like, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And like I came in literally like from ground zero with nothing, no contacts, nothing, and tried really hard to make a name for myself and just become more visible. And that's what led me to work with people who didn't always have the best intentions for our work, but they just wanted to make a profit. So it's like we also have to talk about these things, because these are the people who are quick to call themselves an expert, who are quick to charge you thousands and thousands of dollars to work with you, but yet still at the end of the day, they don't really care about any progress. And I'm not saying it's only white people. It's happened with Black people as well. It's happened with people from Southeast Asian descent, I assure you.
Yeah, so it's a very, very good point. And, just going back to the fact that, there are people who want to have those uncomfortable conversations, who have the lived experience or credentials to come into these spaces and support organizations to move forward with this work. But organizations who are not prepared to those uncomfortable conversations and scapegoat those internal professionals will simply go and find someone who will make it easy for them. He will sit in the dark corner, he will put together, those events, or maybe do some policy audit, maybe create some new policies or disclaimers or anything like that. And that's it. And I have seen that. I have seen that in organizations. I have witnessed that. And ultimately, looking back at those organizations, 2 years from where we are now, nothing has changed. And if anything, just those people have been recycled to new ones. And we've got Amarachi who's joined as well, just saying that there's some great insights that you have shared, Anastasia. And Jubilee is saying that you're right, Melanie. Many are in the field just for profit, sadly. To be a DEI expert, passion is very important, and your desire to see results and change the system. Yeah, so 100% about passion, but I think that there has to be a good sort of ratio between the best intentions and passions and skill also that is required in doing this work and navigating these systems and negotiating and influencing and coaching and all the other things that are on the DEI JD as it stands right now. But thank you so much, everyone, for contributions, and please keep them coming. And I would love to add another layer to the conversation that we are having right now and just explore a little bit this DEI versus HR dynamics. And we had someone in the comments earlier asking that question, if DEI is a HR role. We had Rita asking that question as well, so we'll pick on that a little bit. And for me, so I also have sat within HR people, talent acquisition teams, however, organizations label them. And from at least, what I have seen, the DEI role does not sit right within that department, because, well, first and foremost, HR has been built on generations of qualifications and training that has not even mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion. Probably now it does, over the past couple of years, the curriculum maybe has been updated with a couple of modules on that. But really, we have had, HR teams over generations been raised, developed with absolutely no conversation around DEI. And therefore, our top of the tree HR professionals not necessarily are equipped to do this work. And also, we do see HR as a business function. That's probably another conversation, whether it's seen as a business function, whether it's treated as business function or not, but it's a business function. It is there to serve the business. Now, what DEI is seen, or I guess expected to do, is serve the people and serve the culture. So there is often, already that unpleasant dynamic that goes on between DEI and HR. And we often have, the Chief Diversity Officer of Google, Melanie Parker, she is a C-level, so she's a chief, but she still sits within HR function and actually doesn't report into the C-level. So, and we've got, plenty of those where actually, again, DEI is not necessarily taken seriously enough to be put on the C-level or reporting into the C-level or board. So I'd love to explore this sort of dynamic between DEI and HR, and should DEI work report into HR? Or should it be sort of a standalone thing, and where should it sit? And I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this. Anastasia, would you like to go?
Oh, sorry, I'm trying to gauge if Melanie is trying to say something or not. Would you like me to go ahead? Oh, sure thing. I think we should be talking about how DEI can be applied to HR to transform HR culture and transform HR as an institution. And so let me preface that by saying that, this critique is not personal. I'm sure there are absolutely amazing DEI practitioners within the HR space, but building on what you said, Baiba, about the history of HR, right? It's not, historically, it's not only been as an institution, as a kind of body that manages relations, within organization. It has not only been an institution that focuses on skills of professionalization. It has historically been an institution that has protected those in power. It has been historically an institution that did not protect survivors of sexual harassment or violence within an organization. It has not historically been an institution that has taken lived realities of racism, anti-Black racism, or xenophobia within an organization seriously, right? There has been historically a disciplining function embedded within the HR before we saw this rapid change in culture, since 2020, but certainly in the last 5 to 7 years, when issues of inclusivity, diversity have started becoming part of the mainstream. But when we think about organizational culture, before that, HR was an extension of the business function. And the role of HR historically has been to manage workers, right? And I talk a lot about the lack of class consciousness and diversity, equity, and inclusion work. When we think about a business entity and HR, HR's function is to manage workers, to manage employees. And I specifically use the language of workers, right, versus kind of the more professional language of employees or practitioners, professionals within the space. And so if we are thinking about DE&I as work that is necessary to transforming the culture of businesses, then why are we letting HR off the hook? Because HR has not been historically a safe space for people with marginalized identities. I have personally, as a grad student working an intern at a place that I will not name, have been disciplined by HR for speaking up and had, have my manager step in for talking about immigrant rights and about, why we couldn't share information about a protest, around, rights, immigrant rights at the border here in the U.S. on the, the corporate listserv, on the business listserv. Immediately was discipline called into HR, right, and threatened with being let go. And so all it is to say that I think that DI should be applied to HR. We should be honestly talking about how could we possibly conceive that a major function of a business is somehow devoid of all the other issues that dynamics that we're trying to fix in a particular business or organization. So to me, I am, I don't know if I said this before, I'm a big fan of DI professionals having their own businesses, their own consultancies that can actually be an independent practitioner within the space and not depend on the departments or particular institutions that are already existing within an organization and are actually historically in a very complicated relationship to the business model and to what it means to manage workers. And historically, it's not to give workers more rights, better pay, etc. But thanks for bringing up this topic because I clearly have a lot of opinions about it. I think it's very important.
Thank you for saying that. No, you raised some really, really important points around it being, where the policy lives, where policy for workers lives, and what is done by that policy. You police with that policy, right? And it's to protect business reputation, to protect business rights, business bottom line. And so, I love that you talked about, DEI being applied to HR rather than reporting into it and fulfilling a HR function, but being applied to HR. And we have Jihan has just mentioned, saying, and I think she mentioned Anastasia, love the language of workers because it's key to ensure that DEI is weaved into the organizational culture. And Peter Moore has also popped a comment in saying that how do we reconcile the DEI expert who disagrees on whether unconscious bias exists or not, and who then is the expert if one takes or rejects this view of unconscious bias? Does anyone have views on that? Would love to hear before I go to Melanie with the previous question.
Or maybe actually, I'll back off on my position. Maybe I'll back off on my position and say that we do need some entry requirements, and the fundamental entry requirement should be that, whether conscious bias exists or not is not up for debate, right? And if anything, we should be moving beyond the language of bias, right? We should be talking about structural oppression, right? And so we can have a whole lot of conversation, about the kind of language we use and the concept that we use in this space. But that seems to be like a minimum requirement, in my opinion.
I love that. Thank you. Melanie?
Just to bounce off what Anastasia just said, I have seen DEI experts on LinkedIn have discussions talking about how we all have biases, but we cannot all believe that we all fall prey to like our unconscious biases. I am a Black woman. And historically, that means I come from a marginalized background. And I know I have my unconscious biases. I know that there are things that have happened, like me growing up, consuming the media that I've consumed, that there are things that make me question. Sometimes I see something and I'm like, And then I have to tell myself, no, Melanie, this is wrong. You have to rethink this. You have to analyze this. Where is this thought coming from? And I have to process this. So how can you, as a DEI expert, say that unconscious bias does not exist? But we see it on LinkedIn all the time. I'm sorry to say, but you see people getting into arguments with people who say they work in HR and they're huge supporters and advocates of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging in their titles. Yet still, these conversations are still being had. And I'm sure we'll probably see one next week with the same thing and hundreds of people arguing with them, telling their tagging their job, telling them, is this the person that you have working in DEI or HR at your company? So yeah, that's just, yeah. And then to go back to the original question, what are the DEI and HR dynamics? I think, again, to take it a step further from what Anastasia just said, I think DEI needs to be at every single point of a company. It's not only about HR, it's not only about admin, it's not only about whatever sector you're in, institution, company, whatever. You need to have DEI woven throughout the structure of that company. And it's something, if I have to apply to a European context, which is not happening at all at the moment. It doesn't matter if we're talking about disability rights, if we're talking about LGBTQ plus rights, if we're talking about, well, in France, we don't really have the right to talk about ethnicity and religion and race, but these are things that are not happening at a lot of companies. We're not having this discussion. So I think we have to take it a step further instead of just saying, yes, DEI professionals can report to HR or not. We have to think what's going on throughout the company in the first place. Why isn't DEI like part of their overall best practice strategy? And as all of you said in different ways, I always think that HR is there to protect the company, while DEI is there to take care of the employees. And a lot of companies are not really understanding that as yet, because again, the DEI that we know, that we advocate for, it's not the same type of DEI that's happening in a lot of different companies. So you have businesses, especially in Europe, thinking that you can just pluck somebody from HR and have them be in charge of their whole DEI strategy, when these people don't really, it's not that they don't care, but they never really had the thought or the passion or the interest in thinking about DEI beyond what was previously known within their country, specifically in France, I can speak of, and in Europe, across Europe. So I think you can have HR and DEI working alongside each other, but I don't think that you should have DEI professionals specifically reporting to HR. That's just me personally, from my personal experience of working with different organizations. A lot of the organizations have no idea what it actually means to advocate for rights for their employees. So why should HR, who is just there to, I'm not saying just there, because there are HR people who do care about DEI, but who is actually just there to protect the company and make sure that all the complaints that different employees have brought across are just swept under the rug and not reported to the public and not made known throughout the company internally itself. I think these are my thoughts on this for the matter.
And let me just echo on what you just said. What stuck with me was, the DEI that we advocate for or work on is not the same DEI that organizations are, the work that organizations are engaged in. And I think that's actually, an interesting point to sort of, for organizations to sit and unpack. The fact that they're engaged in DEI work doesn't mean that they've done the work and they shouldn't be kept accountable for what they're doing, because they might be creating more harm with the DEI work that they are doing. And also, talking about the HR and DEI dynamics, because I have seen a lot of HR admins, internal comms people, for instance, being, especially over the past 2 years, repurposed into a DEI manager or a DEI person because they have been the most passionate over the past few years, or because maybe they're the only person of color within the team, and obviously they have to take that role on. But sort of, some of the teams, for instance, what I have seen in some of the teams and clients that I have worked with, especially where the DEI role is held by a white person or white woman, in some of the examples that I have from my experience, without naming anyone, but there is a real fragility that lives there. And what I mean by that is that, I have seen these white women specifically, I'm talking about right now, getting very uncomfortable about very basic DEI conversations. And then my question is, what are your skills, or how can you now walk into, let's say, an executive board and challenge them on their privilege or educate them on these topics if you can't even hold your ground about, in basic conversations around this topic, and you get self-defensive and run out of the room or call names or point fingers? And I've seen that happening in broad daylight in front of my eyes. So these are not fairy tales. So it's real things that are happening within organizations, and hence this work starts with our own household before we can go out and start claiming awards. And this is another interesting thing, as I've been doing the job description audit, that some of the job descriptions explicitly say that the DEI manager, or sometimes head of DEI, would have to ensure, and funny enough, this specific JD came from academia, from a university, that this professional head of DEI would have to actively fill out all kinds of recognition forms to make sure that the university is always recognized for the work that they are doing. So that's an interesting requirement. But as we are, very quickly approaching our the end of the hour together, I would love to just sort of reflect on everything that we've talked about, because and also, one thing probably I want to call out is that as we are talking about quote unquote DEI expert, we're not discouraging people to come in this space who want to actively and consciously and with a critical consciousness, to use Anastasia's words, to come into this space and actively contribute to creating positive impact. We're not discouraging people to come in this space and do that, and you don't need to be DEI quote unquote expert to do that. But yeah, you do have to have a critical consciousness to do that kind of work. And so I would love to sort of reflect on everything that we've talked about. It would be great to share some advice to potentially those looking to positively contribute to this work, and also organizations who are hiring this space. what would be some of sort of the last things you would like to leave us with?
Melanie, would you like to go ahead?
Sure.
Sit that one.
Well, I personally would hope that there would be more Black and Brown people, as well as other people of color, coming into this space, because especially women, because I think especially in Europe, we don't see a lot of Black women represented. We don't see a lot of brown women represented. We don't see people of color, women of color represented in general. And that's why I started the Black Women in DEI Europe event, which I held last year and hopefully we'll be having this year as well. And it's just so we can show what we go through in the countries that we live in, and to show people, especially in the West, especially in the US, that yes, there are Black people who live in Europe, because having conversations with my colleagues who work in DEI, a lot of them don't even realize that there are Black people living in France, especially from the French overseas departments like in Martinique, Guadeloupe, Réunion, Mayotte, and all of these things. A lot of people have no idea what's going on when it comes to Europe and our diversity work. So I just hope that with the work that all of us are doing, Amarachi and Chikere and Haley and Vivian, everybody knows Vivian, that as well as Naomi, that we just get more people to realize that we do have struggles in Europe. It's not perfect. I know the people in the US usually think that Europe is paradise, like nothing is going on, like there's no racism. We everybody just having fun and eating baguettes, and it's like, no, people are actually facing real situations and issues when it comes to their work-life balance in Europe, and we just want to shine a light on that. Also, let me get back to the question. Advice for those looking to positively contribute to this work and to organizations hiring in this space. I think organizations need to use consultants when it comes to even coming up with job descriptions, when it comes to inclusive language, when it comes to especially inclusive language. I think Bible kind of counts to that, like to that when we look at Europe and our job descriptions. There's so much progress that needs to be made. And I just cannot even understand how in 2022 you're hiring for a DEI person and you're not using inclusive language. And when people point this out to you, you're saying, oh, we've been doing this for years, so we're not going to change it because you, a DEI person, is bringing this up to us. It's very mind-boggling to me. And I just hope that instead of we'll not really need DEI experts anymore, we'll just have it so interwoven within these companies that they will just be thinking about how can we make our companies more inclusive, and how can we make people feel like that they actually belong. It doesn't, irrespective of their background. And these are just my hopes. I hope they're not too far-fetched, especially in Europe. Anastasia.
Yeah, well, the thoughts I have, I guess, build up on Melanie's comment. And I think what, advice for those looking to positively contribute to this work, I think Melanie rightly points out the kind of need for more voices of Black women and women of color in this space. And I think what I would have to say for those looking to positively contribute to this work, particularly to white people who want to be in allyship, is that you don't necessarily have to become a D&I expert or DI practitioner in order to contribute to this work. And so that's one of the reasons why I personally have, stayed kind of 1 foot in this space and 1 foot in cultural research and brand strategy, which is what I do, because I do think that you can apply DI thinking, which is, I think, what I said in the beginning, to any line of work, to any space within which you are. And I think we do need to have a more expansive understanding of what it means to do equity work, not just being with this kind of concentrated DI space that is becoming oversaturated with white people entering this space, with good intentions, trying to do well, trying to be an ally. But maybe we can reimagine how, people who have marginalized identities or people who just want to be in solidarity, want to contribute, and want to work together towards a shared vision of radical social change can actually find other ways to be active in this space. It's not to say, again, as Baiba mentioned earlier, that we are discouraging people from entering, but I do think that there is a kind of oversaturation of white professionals in this field, which is not to say, that is fundamentally a problem, and I say this as a white person with a degree in Black studies, but I do think that we have to honestly talk about that and think about other ways. Are you involved in your community? What is happening in your neighborhood? Are you involved with the grassroots activist work that is happening in your city? This is specifically perhaps true for the United States, where there's a lot of history of civic engagement and public, activism that is much more organized and active than in some other places. Or, I grew up in Europe and in Eastern Europe, for example. So I think that goes for individuals. Can we reimagine, as I said, what it means to do DE&I work in other industries? What if I work in advertising? What if I work, in sales? Do I necessarily need to switch careers in order to contribute positively to the space, to be an ally? I don't think so. And as far as organizations hiring in this, in this space, you mentioned the word far-fetched. So I think my advice is very far-fetched. But I think it's, being open to people who might be unconventional, by me untraditional, might make you uncomfortable. I think there is a cultural switch that needs to happen within organizations in their understanding of what it means to do D&I work. And it's not necessarily about packaged solutions, but it's about bringing in people who can provide a radically different lens for what you're used to. And I think we slightly need to prioritize that more as we're hiring people in organizations. We're not supposed to be hiring people who are going to fit in and, merge into organizations. We're supposed to hire disruptors, people who can actually intervene what's happening within a company.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for sharing those final thoughts. And I think there's a lot around, start with your own home. Think about what voices are included and heard and which ones are not. And maybe before, reaching out to an organization or a consultant for a packaged solution, using your words, Anastasia, it actually is insulting to some of the people who have been very active and loud and proud within the organization, people of color, LGBT, whatever communities you might have. You have those voices. I guarantee you have those voices within your organization, some more than others, but you have those voices. So listen to your people first, to your own communities first and foremost. And just, and just get engaged in the work. Also, as if you are engaged in DEI work, have another, look at what you're doing. If that work that you're doing actually is creating and contributing to positive impact, or you're actually creating, more harm and creating more barriers than anything. And obviously, it's Black History Month in the US, it's Pride Month in the UK. And another thing, think about your partnerships. Think about what partnership means to you as an organization, because again, in my work, what I have seen a lot is organizations would be, for instance, sponsoring the Pride, giving them the money just so they could slap their brand on Pride's material ultimately, and then call themselves, we are partnering up, we are the partners. But what does partnership means? That's sponsorship, that's not partnership. And what about, you're bringing in, obviously we are in COVID, but again, thinking about, my career, when we were able to, not only were able to, but we were expected to be in offices, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And, organizations that I've worked for have sponsored, certain events, including Pride. But then, why are we not inviting these people in and saying, we've got amazing spaces, we've got amazing meeting rooms. Why don't you come and have your meetings here? So maybe some of us can join and listen in and ask questions and grow. But none of that is happening. It's just a name slapped on Pride. And actually none of us internally ever knew what does that partnership look like and what it actually means long term. So it really, encourage and invite people and organizations particularly to just unpack what professionalism means and looks like in your organization. What does partnership means and looks like within your organization? Which voices are not heard and not invited to be in certain spaces within our organization? And are we reaching out to external help without first and foremost listening to these people. So you just, start with creating some consciousness and awareness about what's happening within your own house. So I shall leave you on that, and thank you so much everyone who has joined and shared their questions and views and contributed to the conversation. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you, Melanie. I appreciate you, Anastasia, for coming here. Anastasia, I know you are an early bird and you rise very early today in New York to be here with us in this conversation.
That's how important this was. So thank you.
And thank you so much. It has been such a very, very rich conversation. I do feel that there is a lot for people to take away. So I do hope that people will keep on coming back to this conversation, keep on picking out those nuggets that we've covered here. So thank you so much, ladies, and I will wish you a wonderful day. Wish everyone a wonderful day, and I'll see you next Friday for our next conversation.
Bye. Thank you for having us.
It was a pleasure meeting you, Melanie.
Same here, Anastasia.